the byproduct of fermentation is actually the alcohol and carbon dioxide that we are actually looking for.
Okay, you're on your way to your first great brew. Now you're going to hear from our experts about an essential role in the brew process, fermentation. You'll also learn about the different types of fermentation, so let's go.
In this next lesson, you're going to learn all about fermentation. After that, we're going to learn about fermentation lag time, and then we're going to talk about active fermentation and other forms of fermentation.
Fermentation is a metabolic process of yeast. So during the course of fermentation, the yeast reproduce, they eat, they build up stores of their food source for a next generation, they go into a dormant phase and they build up reserves of food. All that happens during fermentation, and the byproduct of fermentation is actually the alcohol and carbon dioxide that we are actually looking for. So in making wort, what you're really trying to do is make the best home for yeast you possibly can, so that they will then give you the best beer you possibly can get. But it's not in the interest of the yeast to make sure your beer is the best, because what you're really looking for is their byproducts, the CO2 and alcohol. That's why higher alcohol fermentations are more difficult, because some yeast strains don't like to live in their own waste at very high concentrations. At our level, a beer will ferment usually 3 to 4 days. At the end of 3 to 4 days, hopefully 3 days is target, we will have skimmed yeast off for future pitches, and then we call cold crash, and that involves the rapid decrease in fermentation temperature from our target beer temperature during fermentation of 68 down to 38. The goal being to drop the yeast, what we call the yeast load, and that's the number of yeast cells still in suspension, drop them down to a very low level, let's say 1 to 2 million cells per milliliter, so that we can then rack the beer or transfer it into kegs. That process takes about two days. So sometimes we'll leave it for 3, depending on production cycle. Beer typically isn't in the tank for more than 7 days.
When it comes to fermentation, the ideal one is cool your beer quick, put a lot of yeast in, and 2 weeks later you've got beer. That's the general. That's the best scenario. If you overpitch or you underpitch, you're gonna get a different effect, a different ester in the beer. Underpitching, and pitching being how much yeast you pour into the batch. Underpitching, it stresses the yeast because they've got this big sugar environment. They're creating alcohol. Their population is low, so you get different byproducts that they squeeze out from the stress. You overpitch, they're gonna eat it all up, and you may not catch those esters that you're hoping to get, the fruitiness and what you're looking for in your target beer. If you get a fermentation where you're not clean, you have an infection in one of your vessels, didn't get cleaned quite good enough, and there's some bacteria or some wild yeast, then it can get crazy. It can bubble up and just spew all over the place. It can get sour. It can taste like dirty dishwater. There's a number of things that can go wrong if you don't start clean, and that's at any point too. The yeast they metabolize like we metabolize, and they can only metabolize what's within their range. So there's residual sugars that they can't break down that long chain of sugar. But you get your wild yeast in there, they can get those. So they'll start eating those, and that's where you get your overcarbonation and those off flavors, the sour flavors, the dirty flavors. And then there's those breweries that all they do is sours, and they know how to manipulate those yeasts and get the good sour flavors and not the dirty ones.
Lag time, I think, is something that gets blown out of proportion in home brewing, because We're looking at certain parameters on the professional level, but we're not checking the beer every like 2 hours. We're not saying, oh, it didn't start by now. Like, oh shit.